You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding. Between 2 and 6% of people have hoarding disorder, yet very few of us talk about it. Learn about the condition from me, somebody who has it, as well as academics, therapists and other experts I interview. Find out how to support the podcast at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. Finally, I am not a doctor, I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. So I am here with Dr Jan Eppingstall. She is a counsellor, she's a researcher, she has a PhD, she eats, sleeps and speaks hoarding more than anyone I know. We are very lucky to have her. Jan, how are you?
Oh, very well. It's great to be here. And yes, I do eat, sleep and dream everything hoarding. In fact, my go-to dream is about being in a rush to pack up someone's house or my own, but it is a regular occurrence. So I do feel like I sleep, breathe, eat hoarding.
I want to thank the person who left the podcast a 2-star review because they don't like the way I talk.
Oh, I love the way you talk. Who the heck is this person?
And so all I can say is thank you for engaging. There's just not a whole lot I can do about the way I talk.
No, exactly. You just got to live with it. Oh.
But yeah, women get criticised for the way we talk a lot as well.
I know.
I feel like we can't win.
And I do it myself. Like I go, oh, I don't like that woman's voice. And then I think to myself, I've never said that about a man, or very rarely.
It's funny, is it? We're either too shrill or too whatever. Anyway,
yes.
I can't change that, nor would I especially want to change the entire way I talk to please somebody. So there is always a full transcript of every episode if you can't deal with it, and sorry about that. So today we are talking about habituation, which is one of those things that sounds like a complicated, inaccessible word, but in fact is something we can all recognise in ourselves, and you will as soon as we start talking about it. So, Jan, can you start by explaining what habituation is?
Okay, well, it's a form of non-associative learning in which a non-reinforced response to a stimulus decreases after repeated or prolonged presentations of that stimuli.
And in English, please?
Basically, what that means is we just get used to things. We become used to stuff that we're exposed to. That is all it means. So the more times we're presented with a particular stimuli, whether it be, sound or something visual or a smell, for example, and when it's presented to us close in time, we react less and less and less each time. So our neurons just stop firing. They don't recognize it as being something new. We just basically become used to it. It's like we get used to background noise or odours like cigar smoke. I remember I'm old enough to remember the days of smoking in pubs, and actually, somewhat miss it, really. It's kind of an atmospheric thing. But you just get used to the smell.
Pubs without ashtrays are still odd, aren't they?
Weird.
Although you then watch something on TV from the 90s and it really stands out that people are smoking. So, yeah.
Exactly. It's strange, isn't it? But if you watch Mad Men, you're fine with it. Like they just smoke constantly. So, yeah. So it's really just, it's just really this thing that happens all the time. Our brain stops responding to things that don't change. And we share that with all animals on Earth. I mean, even bacteria won't respond to something if it's there for a prolonged period of time. So it's not particularly difficult. It just sounds like it is.
Yeah, exactly. Is habituation, say we stop noticing our mess. Obviously, this is a key topic for this episode. Is that like a form of denial? Is it avoidance, or is it neither of those things?
It's probably a bit of all of those things, somewhat. But habituation is not really something that we do consciously. It's evolutionary. It's something that is kind of built into our makeup. But I do think that denial in some ways and avoidance does play a little bit of a part in us not noticing what's happening around us. I don't think it's completely 100% habituation. I do think there are other factors that influence us shutting off to whatever it might be that we don't like, either about ourselves or about our space, about our lives. So, I think it's a bit of all of those things.
And when I was doing some research to prepare for this episode, it really struck me that habituation in itself is not a bad thing. It serves numerous purposes, like to prevent us from becoming overwhelmed and allow us to focus. So I was thinking about, there are ways in which habituation is good and necessary, I would argue. There are ways it's neutral and there are ways it's negative. So in terms of when it's necessary and good, we can't survive if we notice every single colour, every single texture, every single noise, every single thing. If I was sitting here thinking constantly about how the chair feels, and you would be exhausted within seconds. And we can tune out the sound of the baby crying next door, or the dog barking, or the car alarm. When it's neutral, I think an example of that would be something like if we've got a journey we do regularly, and the first 10 times we do it, we notice a building and think, wow, that's unusual. And then a few years later, you're doing the same journey and you haven't noticed the building. And then it can also be negative. So we can stop noticing reminders that worked at one point. I went on the pill when I was a teenager, and I put a Post-it note on my mirror thinking, I look in the mirror every morning, this will remind me to take the pill. Worked for a week, after which I stopped seeing the reminder, even though it was still on the mirror. It was still on the mirror 2 years later when I left home. I hadn't seen it for years. If I sleep through a particular alarm tone once, that's it. Never wakes me up again. We've finished, this one is particularly painful, finish a cup of tea without even noticing drinking it. Cruel world.
Or driving home, and you arrive and you're like, how did I get here? That autopilot feeling.
I was driving a regular route after researching this episode, and I noticed that there's on this route, there has been for years, there's one of those, sometimes they put speed cameras and they make it very obvious. There are big signs. And how when I used to drive on that road, I would always be really conscious of that bit of the road, going, got to be extra careful here. And how now I get past that bit of the road and go, I didn't even pay attention. Thankfully, I'm not a big speeder, so I'm, generally all right. But that kind of, the thing that used to make me extra alert, now I just sail by. Is there anything I've missed there about kind of the role of habituation in our lives?
I think there is one thing to kind of note about habituation, and that is that it does drive us to progress. Like without it, we wouldn't have had that motivation to learn, develop, or change as a species. So, I mean, just imagine if everything was new and exciting all the time. Like we, wake up in the morning and oh, wow, a blunt-headed axe. That's awesome. What does that do? Like if we got excited by that stuff, we wouldn't have advanced at all. Technology would have just remained exactly as it was when we were living in caves or whatever. And habituation does make us kind of unsatisfied and bored, kind of restless and kind of greedy in some ways. So the species needs this for us to progress, and that actually makes us happy. Joy often comes from moving forward, changing, learning, evolving. And I guess the other thing about that I wanted to kind of mention is that as humans, being perfect and having a perfect environment is not something that we actually enjoy as a state. I don't know if you watched the show The Good Place. I don't know if you saw that.
I've seen some of it, yeah.
Yeah, if you kind of know what I'm talking about. I didn't know this, but the premise was actually based on a Twilight Zone episode from like years and years ago. But a quick synopsis is that a group of people die and find themselves in an office, and they're told that they've reached heaven. So they settle in with their perfect love match and get the life that they've always dreamed of, that they've always wanted. And eventually they kind of come to realize that they're not actually in heaven. This is the other place, because there's just no need for them they just feel bored, restless, and unsatisfied. So I think that's part of this whole, we need to remember that when we think about habituation, that it's not something bad. We wouldn't have progressed if we hadn't habituated to some of these things in our lives, in the history of man. We do need that to kind of push us forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, and I hadn't known this, habituation can also be used deliberately in the treatment of some mental health conditions, pain conditions, and even tinnitus. For example, it can be used for anxiety as a form of exposure therapy, very incremental and intentional to build tolerance. There's a video that I will include in the show notes that I found really interesting, and the person was talking about the ability to get bored with the stimulus, so get less sensitive to triggers. That reminded me of the fear ladder stuff.
Exactly.
Is there a form of this kind of approach that could help hoarders?
Definitely. Like, this is one of the methods that clinicians will use to kind of build that tolerance, as you say, or they might use the term, expand. They might say expand the window of tolerance, which is kind of how I would use it. I would work in that way, because growth happens at the edge of that window. And this means we have to do something differently, something that's not in our comfort zone to move forward. So creating that fear ladder with incremental increases in behaviour that brings us closer to the feared stimulus is kind of what a clinician would probably use. So for me, I have a fear of escalators, typically those extremely long, steep ones.
London Underground. Yeah.
Oh, my God. And that happened to me in London. I didn't realise. I got there and my husband's like, oh, let's go up the escalators. And I have just frozen.
Yeah.
Stood there going, oh, my God, and hyperventilating, going, I don't know if I can go up here. Where
yeah, they're terrifying. Yeah.
Terrifying. So for me, and this is why I will never, ever belittle someone for a fear or a phobia, because I know how it feels. So just looking at a picture is going to trigger my anxiety. So for me, step one might be imagining that escalator. So just visualizing it in my mind. Next might be looking at a picture of one, and then maybe next is a video. Then it might be going to the steepest escalator in my city, which is Parliament Station. It freaks me out. And standing at the bottom and look up. And then it might be standing at the top, look down, and then going on the escalator with people I know in front, behind, and then just in the front, and then on my own. The other thing is that, those are the kind of stages, but you can skip a stage. Sometimes it's good to skip a stage or go back a stage in order to kind of mix it up intermittently so that you're not anticipating what might come next. But for hoarding, I really do feel like, creating that fear ladder of, well, what would happen if I let someone take that item away for a period of time, or, creating that ladder of fear can work very, very well to help people approach that fear of letting go of things, approach that fear of not buying something that they felt they needed at the time. It's definitely a treatment method that can work.
Yeah, as I've talked about before, a emetophobic, and years ago, it might still exist, there was a website all about emetophobia, and one of the things they had was like a DIY exposure therapy thing, and it literally started with a page with the letter V, and then the next page VO, building up to vomiting, and kind of went on from there. And I appreciated that really gradual, because the letter V is not used much. So if you have that fear, you might well make that connection just from that letter. Similarly, when I was building up to seeing the dentist, and was seen by a specialist team, and the first several appointments were me just walking into the dental room, saying hi to people and leaving, and maybe sitting on the chair, or maybe, and it really, by the time I opened my mouth for the dentist to have a look in, I knew her, I knew she was nice, I knew the chair was comfy, and we just kind of did it from there.
Exactly. And it's still, if I haven't approached an escalator for a while,
Yeah.
it still is a problem. Like I got over it for a while because I was going up and down down the escalators often. But when I stopped approaching it, I kind of in some ways had to start again. And I think that's the same with the approach in therapy, is that you kind of need to keep stepping out of that comfort zone to interact with whatever it is that you fear, because you do kind of go back to square one a little bit. Probably not as bad, because you can do it, but it is something that does require you to keep interacting with whatever that stimulus is.
And we should also say at this point that autistic people may not habituate to stimuli as much, which can explain why the world can be very overstimulating for autistic people. And so if you are on the autistic spectrum, and we know there's a lot of crossover with neurodivergence and hoarding, we know this, if that's the case with you, your experience of this may be a bit different. But I do think there will be elements of what we talk about that can still help you to understand what's going on for you.
Yeah, I mean, I had a bit of a look into this. It was a bit difficult because there was some indication that kind of sensory habituation is reduced in ASD, both auditory and visual. And it kind of said, the research that I found suggested there may be prolonged attention to visual repetition. So like watching something spin for long periods, that type of thing, and maybe reduced attention to social stimuli. So interacting with people and their faces and that sort of thing. The research was hypothesizing that this kind of reduction in habituation could lead to the sensory overload or overreaction and exaggerated perception of environmental changes. So sensory overstimulation, distress, and that kind of perception that the environment's unpredictable, that might be why in some cases people on the spectrum use repetitive behaviours or stimming in order to kind of counteract that overstimulation, and that might be how they control the unpredictability and kind of impose a structure, which I thought was kind of interesting. I don't know that they really understand it fully. But the other thing which is really important to remember, as you've just mentioned, having autism, it's on a spectrum, of course. So findings are understandably mixed. Like I have a client who needs music to be so loud that she can feel it so that she can focus. So she needs the actual like speakers to be pumping, but her son needs complete quiet. So two people with autism on the complete other ends of the spectrum. And that's what makes it so hard. It is an individual thing. And knowing that when we're talking about habituation, it may not impact you at all. You may have the same sort of experiences, or you may have completely different ones. But I do think it's important to mention that it can be different in the neurodiverse population.
And speaking of neurodiversity, there's a dopamine connection as well. If there's something we do that gives us a dopamine boost, the more we do that behaviour, the less and less dopamine we get each time. So that habituation can connect to the need for novelty so that we keep getting that lovely dopamine. And I would say you have things to say about the relevance of that in hoarding.
Yes, you also do. How insightful of you.
If you want to help to support this independent podcast that is dedicated to spreading awareness and understanding of hoarding disorder and is really unique in what it offers, please do subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. Leave a review and share it with your friends or anyone who might be interested. It all helps. Find out how to offer support at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's a really important point. I've talked before, I think, on the podcast about the mere exposure effect, which relates directly to that habituation and hoarding. So people tend to develop a preference for things, art, music, faces, objects, simply because they're familiar. So the first few repetitions of exposure to something might increase the person's level of joy, but this eventually decreases, of course, due to habituation. But what it also leads to is comfort, familiarity, safety signal, signaling safety and certainty. Okay. And we know and have discussed this before also that hoarding is an externalizing and avoidant disorder. So this comfort and familiarity with our home environments keeps us in our comfort zone. The stuff might not be bringing us kind of unbridled joy anymore, but it certainly feels comfortable. So when we avoid the negative experiences in our life, like distress or discarding, one of the main behaviours in hoarding, we also end up missing out on the positive emotions and find ourselves living in that grey with neither highs nor lows. So in terms of acquiring, we need to find more treasures to bring home to feel that rush of dopamine. And very quickly, this doesn't work anymore. We have all this stuff around us with no use for it. But the other thing I realised as I was working on this episode was this. When things are hidden in the hoard, this habituation occurs. Okay, so it's hidden in there. We haven't seen it, that object, for ages. So that object surprises us again. So this is kind of the joy of finding treasures long forgotten. And it gives us this massive surge of dopamine. It's like I've seen it time and time again. It's always like this euphoria that you found this thing that you thought was lost.
Yeah.
It kind of made me wonder, like, is hoarding like living in an adventure? Is this kind of like a way for people to sort of hide and find things again or something? I just want to know what you think about that.
I don't think it's deliberately that.
No.
I do think I did an interview on the podcast a while ago with a woman called Jasmine Slay, who is a professional organizer who works with people with a lot of clutter. And she'd written a book about her experience of this. And one of the things that really stood out to me from the book and from the conversation I had with her was that in her experience, we worry a lot about regretting getting rid of things. But in her experience, and I'm going to say in mine of doing it, the joy of finding things we thought we'd lost or had forgotten about is so much more common and bigger than the regret of getting rid of something. And we can only really find those things when we start getting rid of things. And so while I don't think there's a deliberate, I'm going to hide my nice things so I can have a happy day in 6 years when I reapproach this pile,
Mm.
I do find myself, if I'm starting to give myself excuses as to why I mustn't bother, I do find myself proactively reminding myself of what Jasmine said and the reality of that, the truth of it. And I do use that to encourage me when I'm feeling sluggish and like I don't want to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And the whole regret, it really fades pretty quickly. Like that sense of regret does take a massive dive. I mean, I think the joy of finding something too can be fleeting.
Of course, yeah.
But it's a euphoric. Sometimes it's just this. I really thought that I'd lost those letters from Nana, and I can't believe I found them and they're in okay condition. I think the other thing is, yeah, if they haven't been looked after, finding them and them being destroyed can also be
heartbreaking.
A bit of a passion killer as well. Yeah, it's quite sad.
Yeah. When I look back and try and remember times I regretted it and try and remember times I was really happy, the balance is, so far in the lines of being really happy. Like you say, it's mostly fleeting, or it's kind of, funny. Like, that's a funny memory I'd forgotten. And then I move on. But even those bits are nice. And then there's the odd bit that is, this is what I was hoping for years I would find one day. And that is more extended. Yeah.
And that is much more extended, yeah, because it was so important. Like it was kind of a core item or memory or whatever it is. Yeah.
So even before I knew the term habituation, I had an understanding that there are real problems in hoarding with responding less and less to the same stimulus. So I knew that had an effect, like when I started taking the pill, where you put something out as a prompt and stop noticing it. But that can also be your gas bill. It can be everything. I also knew that we get used to compensating for living in clutter, by which I mean stepping over things, moving around things, so it doesn't prompt us to take action to change it. And also, I had become aware that the more we think we need to use visuals to remind us, the less effective the visuals become because they are so numerous as well as becoming habituated.
Yes.
Are those themes things you see a lot in people who hoard?
Completely. Like stepping around things on autopilot's a really common one, or having to move something or move more than one thing in order to get access to the other thing just becomes, it's autopilot.
And it's like, when somebody moves house, and at first they're like, the door opens really weirdly to unlock the door, and but then within 3 weeks, they just know to do the weird thing with the key and it works, or the way the toilet flushes, or something like that. But we, as hoarders, adapt to the stuff that if we made changes, we wouldn't have to adapt to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think it's not knowing what relief that might give you if you didn't have that obstacle anymore. And that's the hard thing to kind of, suggest to people. So, not being able to see the benefit of moving an item to kind of increase the safety or whatever, or suggesting make things simple to put away so it's only a one-step process, get rid of the door, for example, and just have things, accessible and that you use all the time so you don't have to move a dozen things in order to get access to it. But it's the imagination of how would it feel not to have that impediment to doing things that I do on a regular basis. It's hard to describe that to someone and give them a sense that it would make their life easier. But habituation, we all do it to some extent. I know I do it all the time. It takes often an outsider's view to bring it back to our attention. Or like me, recently I had a garage full of stuff, so much stuff that I'd taken from clients for recycling or donating or whatever. And it was an obstacle course. I had to kind of like step over things. I had to make sure I had my foot in the right spot. And when I saw my sons trying to negotiate it, I was moved to act, because I went, oh gosh, I can see how that's impacting someone else. But often we live alone, or we don't have that someone else coming in. So we're not triggered.
Yeah, I visited some friends recently and I went to the loo and one of them said, oh, by the way, the cold tap in the bathroom isn't working. And their couple said to each other, we still haven't got that fixed. But it took them having to remember that somebody else was going to use the bathroom to go, oh yeah, that's a thing that 3 weeks ago was annoying, but we are already used to.
Completely. We had a washing machine that broke. This was a long while ago. And you couldn't open the door. And so my husband had Googled to find out, how to open it without when the hinge was broken or whatever. And it was basically stick a knife into this hole.
Yeah.
And it would pop open. I do not exaggerate. 12 months to 18 months.
Yeah.
We lived with putting the knife in there.
Yeah, I have a friend who can only open her car boot with a screwdriver, and that's how she opens the car boot. She keeps a screwdriver in the glove compartment, gets it out when she needs to open the boot. And some of that is fine. We don't need to, this isn't an excuse for, I need a new this because it's slightly annoying to do it that way. There's a balance. If you can make something work and it's fine, then that's all good. It's about when it starts to interrupt, but you also stop noticing that it's interrupting.
Exactly. You get so good at it that it just doesn't even register. And I agree. We're not suggesting everyone should go out and buy brand new things because something's slightly broken. But I do think it would be good to fix things if there are, if you can make that if you can make that change and fix it, then I think chances are the relief will, you'll forget the relief pretty quickly again, because you'll habituate to the new situation as well. But I think it is important to recognise when there's big impediments to simple chores that you've been overlooking.
What is the cause of this kind of habituation that can feel quite extreme at times, that ability to overlook? Like, I'm looking around my room now, the ability to overlook the chaos. What allows us to do that?
I think one of the things that I thought about with regard to this, and we were talking about how we put those visual cues out there in order to remind us of stuff, and we habituate to that. I think a lot of it's to do with working memory, like we're relying on the visual reminders in our space, but there's so many distractions that we try to hold those things those to-dos in our working memory, and we've only got 5 or 7 slots. So we kind of forget, because everything, there's just too many. I'm looking around and I can see little notes I've made in various places, but I've completely forgotten them. And if I don't use an externalizing system to write down and create a habit around that, of returning to my trusted system or whatever it is to record my to-dos and then cross them off when they're done, that's a way to kind of remind ourselves. All we have to do is remind ourselves, look at your list. If we do that out of habit, then that makes sense. But unfortunately, many of us are in survival mode, and we're only just getting up and getting dressed in the morning and little else. So we don't have the time or the bandwidth to kind of create a trusted system around those reminders, etc. And with regard to stepping over things or moving things, or I think a lot of it is just about stopping and an awareness of what we're doing, that kind of mindfulness, kind of Zen cleaning thing. Okay, I'm going to think about absolutely everything I'm doing here so I can be in the moment. And that can often just blow your mind, because everything you've been doing has been on autopilot without actually even contemplating what you could do better or more easily.
Yeah, because we are going to talk, aren't we, about ways to dishabituate. But yeah, before we get onto that, I thought of, and I'd be interested in your perspective on a connection, a link between people pleasing, pushing through, and habituation. Bear with me. I feel like the ability to push through may be connected to this, because pushing through can be a positive characteristic. It helps us to keep living and functioning when things are difficult, but it can also become negative when we push through things we could and probably should fix. And I feel like I'm pushing through when I step over a box or trip over a thing and ignore it or walk around a thing. And is that a connection that makes any sense to you?
It's very interesting, actually. It's an interesting observation. I think some of us do have that kind of against all odds kind of mindset, like that I can make do and survive kind of, and I'm not, the people pleasing bit. Well, I'm not going to tell anyone I can't manage, I have to just go along with this. And if I can push through and be self-sufficient, and not need to do things differently because I'm resourceful, and I found a workaround. It's almost this pride in being able to do something in the most convoluted way. It's kind of tied into our sense of self in a way. Like that's just part of what I do. And people pleasing and pushing through kind of, and not recognizing that there might be an easier way to do it without giving up on who we are, is sometimes hard to kind of recognize in ourselves, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, I will endure.
Yes.
No? What is it? What is the British motto?
Keep calm and carry on.
Keep calm and carry on.
I carry on. I don't keep calm, but I do carry on.
I do feel that. I do think there is something there that is it's a little bit kind of maladaptive, but it takes a bit of curiosity, kind of look at it and say, I do that, don't I?
Yeah, if I was a bit less good at pushing through, I might have addressed more things. Maybe. So, dishabituation is a change in response due to the presentation of a new stimulus. And dishabituation, I think, is the key to getting unstuck and starting to see things again. So if we need to start noticing things that our brains have tuned out, how can we go about this, particularly in relation to clutter? You mentioned like being really mindful as you move around, paying attention rather than just going from A to B. What other kind of techniques can we use?
I think the simplest thing is to change things up. Like it sounds so simple, but do something different in your day. Eat your breakfast in a new space, go for a walk instead of a run or whatever, or take a different mode of transport to work. Do something different.
Brush your teeth with the other hand.
Yeah.
Nothing makes you realise how weird it is.
Yeah.
Than trying to do it in the wrong order or something. Like when you're showering, wash in the opposite order to the way you normally wash.
Exactly, like things like that. And step out of your comfort zone. Do something new. Listen to music while you're doing the dishes instead of listening to a podcast, or read a real book instead of an ebook before bed. Change your habits up. But even just coming in through a different door, maybe coming through the back door today rather than the front door, just change things up, because it's just being in a rut is really what it is. It's pretty simple in terms of what habituation really is. And changing how you go about doing things is what is going to kick your butt out of the rut and into something new. And it sounds so easy. I'll just change things, just change. But I do believe that if you take the time to kind of observe how you do things before you decide to change things up, if you have that attention placed on, as you said before, how do I actually go about doing these things? How could I do that better? I think people who are super, super organized get in their head a lot, and I do this a lot. I'll focus on one activity that I do often, and I'll be extremely mindful about how I go about it. And then I'll realize there's a much easier, much quicker way to do it if I had just stopped and thought. But I'm doing that all the time. It's tiring and it's probably too much. It's probably more about perfectionism than actually being efficient. But if you can do that around things that are, everyday things, part of your life, making breakfast, getting out the door, those sorts of things, it does make a big difference to the process, the speed, and the effectiveness of your actions. But it is about paying attention.
I'm going to add a few ideas to the list.
Awesome.
Based on experience.
Awesome.
One is walk out and back in again.
Yes.
You've been working on a particular area for 3 hours and you're like, nothing's even changed. And then you go and get a glass of water and come back and go, wow, actually that looks great. So that kind of literally move, come back. Also look through your phone camera.
Yes.
Yeah, however much you're used to your surroundings, there's something about seeing it through a camera, isn't there, that just you see it so differently.
Just taking that photo and going to another space outside or, at the coffee shop or whatever, and looking through those photos, not in the environment, and looking at them. Even people say looking in a mirror, reflecting the room can change your view on the stuff. But yes, taking that photo of the space, looking at the photo outside and see which bits that you haven't even noticed is really good.
And also sometimes I do the going out and coming back in again, but it's hard to explain, but when I come back in, I imagine I'm seeing it for the first time. I imagine seeing it through somebody else's eyes.
Yes, that's a really good one.
So say I know that the gas boiler has to be serviced, and I know that the gas man, not being sexist, it has never not been a man, will have to come in there, go in there, and go in there. When I think, okay, I'm getting on top of this, I go out and walk that route with the gas person's head on, and then I see the things I've missed.
And it's not there's no judgment there. It's just, what will the person need to have access to in order to complete that task? And seeing it from someone else's perspective, seeing it through someone else's eyes, can really open up your awareness of what your space is like. I think that's a really good way, to change and dishabituate from what's right in front of you.
And also, I would say, and it took me I hesitate to even say it because it might sound disheartening, but it isn't. And that is that when you find something that works, you can habituate to that as well.
Mm.
And that can be really depressing at first. You're like, this is brilliant. This is the way I'm going to fix it. And then it just becomes less and less effective. And I used to find that really depressing. Like I would never find the answer. And what I believe now is that the answer is having a selection of approaches that you can mix up so that either you can mix them up deliberately on an ongoing basis, or you can have one ready so that when you start habituating to this one, you've got the next one. And that actually the answer isn't the one you can stick to forever. It's the mixture. And so mixing it up in terms of the way you approach your dehoarding, the way you approach the thinking you're doing, something might only work for a bit, but if it works for a bit, that's brilliant. And embrace that.
It's worked.
And then see what the next one is.
Yeah, exactly. And no judgment around, trying not to judge around, hey, it's not working anymore, because it's not your fault that happened. It's just what happens. It's just how it works. It's like, going to the gym, not that I go to the gym, but that's one of the things that if I went to the gym, people always say, well, change up whatever the routine is that you're doing, because your body will get used to it. So we need to do the same things with our behaviors at home and our habits. They might not always work, and that experimentation of what can I have up my sleeve? If this doesn't work, I can do something else.
Yeah.
Helps.
And what I found interesting, actually quite exciting, was that dishabituation can also help us outside of hoarding to just experience more joy on a day-to-day basis, unrelated to clutter. But when we make a conscious effort to notice the way the leaves are changing on the trees, or to notice the sounds when we're sitting in the park, it can really give us a boost. Can you talk a bit about that?
And I think this is a wonderful thing to kind of ponder.
You know what makes this podcast work? It's you, the listeners. The show thrives due to your amazing support. I work hard on it, and all the time and money I invest is worth it because I know that it helps you as well as me. If you want to lend a hand, there are several options that can really, really help. You can make a one-off or recurring donation. You can head to your podcast app and leave a glowing review. Or you can do your bit to spread the word. If you know someone who hoards, or if you want your friends and family to understand your hoarding better, send them the link or share the episodes on social media. No matter which you do, you're helping keep that Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast on the air. Find out how to offer support at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support.
It's that, being mindful, not mindful, because often our mind is so full of all sorts of worries. We're thinking about fears for the future and ruminating on the past all the time. We're living in our heads 99% of the time, a lot of us. And just noticing like the wonders of nature, the sound of, a loved one's voice or a child laughing. I love hearing a little kid laugh. It's just so sweet. I'm on my walk out the front of the house and I smell a whiff of jasmine or something, or I see the sunrise. Practicing mindfulness allows us to stop that ruminating on the past and feeling fear for the future and be in the moment. And that also allows us to practice gratitude for the little things that we take for granted or that we've habituated to. Making time for gratitude in our life has a massive impact on our mental well-being. But it takes attentional focus in the now. And that is a wonderful way to dishabituate from, and extract pleasure from every day, because pleasure results from incomplete and intermittent satisfaction of desires.
Say that again.
Pleasure results from incomplete and intermittent satisfaction of desires. So good things in life will trigger a burst of joy if you experience them occasionally. If they become frequent, like if we're doing something daily, they stop producing real pleasure and instead they produce comfort, which really struck a chord to me, because there are things that we do every single day and it's a comfort thing. It's not about, you're not actually experiencing great pleasure from it. Food is one thing I know that that happens. Buying new things does that to me. And that's this, treat yourself idea. Don't overdo it because it will become comforting rather than joyful. Just do it intermittently. The other thing I want to say about this as well is invest in experiences rather than material possessions. This was something that the minimalist was all the rage with, the minimalist kind of bandwagon that they promoted in the last decade. But there's also research to support the fact that satisfaction from material goods falls sharply over time, but the satisfaction with experience doesn't decline, and it often increases. We tend to underrate the value of experiences and overrate the value of material possessions. It's sort of a cognitive kind of error. I think it's because we think possessions last for a long, long time. So that means that it will be, this will give me joy for the, and that experiences are fleeting. But the human mind kind of almost sees possessions are the fleeting thing, and that experiences might kind of last forever. Maybe the memories of an amazing trip or something, or hearing an amazing lecture that changes your life or something will still spark something. And it's not because they're fleeting. It's despite the fact that they're fleeting, not because of it. It's that thought process of and we build things up in our minds, don't we? Experiences that we've been on. And that's one of the things that we didn't mention earlier, which I meant to say, is just taking a break from your house and going and staying somewhere else, even with a friend, or going to the countryside for the day, go and get an Airbnb for 2 days and just be somewhere else. When you come back home again, either it will be an amazing relief and you'll adore it, or it'll be a disappointing, I wish my house was more like where I was just staying.
Yeah.
But just going away for a bit and coming back. It's the same with relationships, being away from someone for a little while. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Same with your home environment. But we need to remember experiences can be a wonderful way to, remain joyful.
Definitely. And we've all heard and probably all said, pics or it didn't happen. But you can just experience it.
You can. I heard that was the case. I don't know. It must have been way back in, the dark ages, maybe the 1980s. But yeah.
Like, what if you went to the countryside for the day and you were just in the countryside for the day with no evidence to show people later how pretty it was? You just experienced how pretty it was. A long time ago, I lived in a town that was very beautiful. And when I first moved there, all I could see was how beautiful this town was. And then invariably, over time, it just became the place I lived. And one day when I was feeling particularly disgruntled about something, I was with a friend and he was saying, I don't even notice how nice this place is anymore. And we made ourselves walk home from town as if we were tourists. And it was a real boost. Like, we were both remembering and pointing out the things that had thrilled us. And I don't know what had happened, but for some reason we were fed up.
You were fed up, yeah.
And so I think that has cancelled out some of the usual, oh, it's quite nice here.
It was quite nice. Oh, it's quite pleasant, this country air, etc. Yeah, I do think that just seeing your city as a tourist, going into Melbourne. I've done it before myself, where I've been with a friend who hasn't seen it, and just kind of seeing it through their eyes for the first time. And you really do take a lot of stuff for granted. And it is kind of a good way to re-experience things. And you can do the same in your own home or in your garden or wherever it might be. I think we all kind of need to do these things on a regular basis so that we are continuing to find joy in our lives.
So I think what we have established is that habituation, first of all, is completely normal. We wouldn't be able to function without it in any meaningful way. It can be really positive when it means that we're not overstimulated by every little thing. It can be neutral, like we just get used to stuff, and it can be negative when it becomes a way to block out the kind of clutter blindness thing, isn't it?
Yes.
But also that it can be used as a way to reduce our response to distress.
Mm-hmm.
So if a stimulus is really distressing, we can take a tiny little step towards it to habituate to it until we're no longer scared by the tiny bit, and then we take another step and then we habituate to that. And when we are really conscious about dishabituating, about stepping away from that habituation, it can actually bring real pleasure into our lives.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's quite an interesting concept. And I think once you know about habituation, it allows you to be, you're more in control of it. I think once you recognize that it's happened, like with a lot of things, the attention that you bring to your life and what you're doing makes the biggest difference.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant, or whatever that saying is.
Yes, exactly.
So, Jan, if people want to find you online, where can they do so?
Well, they could pop over to Instagram and X at stuff_ology, or you could drop me an email, jan@stuffology.com.au. Pop over to the website, stuffology.com.au, and sign up for the newsletter, which I send out every Sunday. It's free, and I love hearing from you.
Amazing. Thank you as ever for your wisdom and contribution.
Thank you for having me. May we take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record and listen to this podcast today. I am speaking on the lands of the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their connection to country, both land and sea, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today.
So shout out this week to the Mind Your Home podcast. I really like what she says here. It is brief but wise. Have a listen.
There's a saying that we often overestimate what we can accomplish in a single day and greatly underestimate what we can accomplish in a single year. And the idea behind this is that we often put way too much on our to-do list on a daily basis to where we can't possibly keep up with it. But we underestimate the value of really small incremental actions and how those can stack and add up to great accomplishments over a longer period of time, like a year.
I will link to the Mind Your Home podcast in the show notes, of course, at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk, where you can also always find every link I mention and a full transcript of each episode. Okay, thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to that Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast.